I know we all know this story, right? It's really popular. It's the only miracle story in the Bible to be in all four of the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell this story, and it's the only story, miracle story, that's in all four Gospels retellings. And so it has become central to our understanding of who God is and who Jesus is and how we are to relate with each other and with God. And even for a story that seems so central to our faith, I learned a few things this week as I was looking into some of the words and some of the historical context of this story, at least as it pertains to our reading today from the book of Matthew. So I thought we might unpack this a little bit together, and I'll share with you what I thought was particularly interesting for this week. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus has already gone to Nazareth. He's already had his moments where he spoke in their religious gathering and they ran him out of town. Do you remember that story? Jesus has already been tempted by the devil in the wilderness. And we have already heard about John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist. Do you remember him? He is Jesus' cousin. And he would go out into the wilderness, away from Rome, away from the temple that had been taken over a little bit by Roman authorities, and there were Roman columns, and it was no longer what he thought of as good religion. And so he said, hey, come out with me out into the wilderness, back to this place in nature where we can start over again. And he would baptize people in the River Jordan, which has a ton of significance. And he would say, let's do a new thing. And right before this miracle story in this gospel, Jesus learns that John the Baptist has been cruelly killed by Roman authorities. And so Jesus says, let's go into the wilderness. And the wilderness is a dangerous place. Yes, it is a place where Moses and the people wandered around for 40 years. And yes, it is where Jesus was tempted. And yes, it is where all of these things happen. But it's also a place where there aren't convenience stores or pizza places or Starbucks. You can't just go get a meal when you need one. You can't find someone when you need them. And chances are, you might find that to be freeing, or you might find that to be terrifying. And so when Jesus hears this news, he withdraws onto the boat, and it says he goes out to a deserted place. He goes out into the wilderness. And I suspect he is thinking about his cousin and all of the ministry that John has done. And the people follow him. They follow him out into the wilderness, not knowing where they're going, because they think Jesus is that important. They'll follow him. They don't know where, but they're going to go. And so they follow the boat, and they end up in this new place. And Jesus sees what has happened. He's trying to get away from them. He just needs a minute. But the verb here, it says Jesus has compassion on the crowd. And so we see Jesus decide, you know what? This is more important. To be with these people in this moment is more important than what I was planning to do. So he's genuinely moved to take action, and he comes out to the crowd and he begins to heal the sick. And so it becomes a day of work for not only him, but also the disciples. And by dinner time, we can imagine the disciples are worn out and they are grieving because they also knew John, and their tummies are rumbling. And they look at what they have on hand, and it wasn't enough for even the 12 of them, let alone 5,000 men plus women and children. And they say, we have nothing. We have nothing. We can't help this crowd. Can you imagine how overwhelming that must have been? It would be like in a stadium of people, and you're like, I don't know how to feed all of these folks. Or maybe your overwhelm is just turning on the news right now and you go, I don't know how to help all of these people. Or maybe you have felt overwhelmed this week because Thanksgiving is coming and you have all of these people coming to your house or you're going to their house. There's a lot of reasons right now to identify with these poor disciples. The overwhelm is going around. And how does Jesus respond to their overwhelm? Anybody? What does Jesus do? He solves the problem? Is that what he does?
He shows the opportunities.
He shows opportunities. Sam, what'd you say?
Yeah.
He feeds them? Does he? I heard it, I think, in the back. Yeah, I love this. They say, hey, Jesus, we can't. And Jesus says, you can. And he instructs the disciples to go feed the people. Now, can you imagine? You're overwhelmed, and you bring it to Jesus, and Jesus is like, you need to do something about it? Talk about compounding problems. Yeah. You know, I listened to a podcast this week that was not about politics, but it had my number, and it said that when we feel overwhelmed, we have a tendency to turn inward and to disconnect. And of course, that is exactly not what we need in those moments of feeling overwhelmed. What we actually need is to reach out or have someone reach out to us and to pull us into community so that we can be together, so that we feel less isolated and alone, but we recognize and we remember that we're a part of this bigger thing. And so I really appreciate these disciples because not only are they saying to Jesus, hey, we have nothing, but then they also say to Jesus, send them away. Make it go away. Make it stop. Make all those people go figure it out for themselves. And that to me just kind of feels like, I get that. Maybe some of us are also feeling that this week. Can someone just make them go away and let this problem stop? That would be great. And instead, Jesus is like, this is your problem. And that's when they took up Buddhism. So Jesus says, you go and do that. You go and feed these people. And because he actually knows that they don't have nothing, they actually say, we have nothing but. And the but is, of course, the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So they are not without resources. They're just overwhelmed and they feel like they don't have enough. And that is when Jesus steps in and he takes what they have and they have a little communion. Because the scripture says he takes what is given and he blesses it, he gives thanks to God, he breaks it, and he hands it back to them and he says, go give this to the people. And that is exactly what we do in communion. And then all of a sudden, there is a wealth of food. And the disciples have something to walk out into the crowds with. And so these people who are feeling isolated all of a sudden become leaders and servers into this enormous crowd. And then at the end of the meal, they are left with a new problem. What to do with all this food? There's no refrigerators. Doggy bags, not so much. It's pretty miraculous. And all of that, I imagine, just starts with that same verb from Jesus. He had compassion on the people. He had compassion, and so he went to heal them. He had compassion on their rumbling stomachs. He had compassion for the disciples. And that's a big deal in our story. Because traditionally in that time, if you were hungry, if you were out of food, you would go to your patron and you would say, "Hey, patron, we don't have enough to eat." And the patron would provide. But there was also a reciprocity. The patron would provide and you would now owe them something, perhaps your labor. But Jesus doesn't do that. He's not a patron. He's poor. He doesn't have the money. He's a carpenter. And now he went from a carpenter to a wandering teacher. He is not in a position to be someone's patron in a traditional Roman sense. But that's why I like that we're out in the wilderness, where God does amazing things and you don't see it coming. And with compassion, he says, let's do this work together. The other piece I want to point towards is the disciples take this food and they become leaders and they start distributing. And the crowd is watching. They see that these ordinary people just like them are empowered to do the work of God. And I bet that the crowd starts wondering if they too could do work like those disciples. Could they too be part of helping to feed all of these folks? Because you know it wasn't just the 12. Other people in the crowd had to participate to feed thousands and thousands of people. And so it was this cascading effect, Jesus to the 12 to more. And then the crowd says, wow, normal people, we're all doing this together. And that kind of leadership is what I like to call compassion-driven change-making. Because I imagine that all of those people that day were empowered to do a new thing. Nobody thought Jesus was going to hand them some lunch when they started walking towards him. And now this change has happened. And I can only imagine what their lives are going to be like after that moment, after this particular meal in the desert. Jesus is there to take care of their needs. And we, like that crowd, are also called to give what we can so that all might be taken care of. And when we think that what we have to give is not enough, we can easily become overwhelmed. And it's just like the people with the loaves and the fishes. They gave even though they were pretty sure this wasn't going to make it all the way around that circle. But they gave anyway, knowing that God can multiply what they have to give, that all can be given enough to eat. But it takes all of us doing our little parts. Because everybody's loaf and everybody's fish makes a difference. And I think maybe the miracle of this story is not so much about the loaves and the fishes, but also about how the Spirit moves us and looks upon us when we feel overwhelmed, and then we dare to connect and take care of one another. That is when the miracles really happen. So friends, whether you are the disciple or you are a person in the crowd, may we give what we have. Even when we feel overwhelmed, may we connect with each other.